Welcome to Art with Mr. Z. Today I want to show you a few tips and tricks you can use to improve the way that you draw features of the face. A lot of people ask me for help with this, and it's something that everybody struggles with because I think most people who want to draw start out at least wanting to draw parts of the face. So let's take a look at how we can improve some of those techniques. The first thing I want to draw attention to is eyes. Usually when we start drawing when we're very young, we get the idea that eyes are basically circles inside of circles. So we start drawing something like this, which we see in cartoons. The Simpsons have eyes like this. Sometimes if we get introduced to manga or anime, we start doing eyes that are kind of like this, but with more of an eye shape to them, which is maybe better. The problem is that we're not drawing eyes the way that they actually look or the way that we see them. We're drawing eyes the way that we think they look according to a set of symbols that we've seen in these cartoons or other kinds of illustrations. Now, there's nothing wrong with drawing eyes this way if you don't mind them not looking realistic. But when you're drawing eyes from observation, it's very helpful to concentrate on how they behave in terms of light and shadow. And what tends to happen is because we're lit from the top, if I draw an eye from the side, for example, light is coming like this. So it's casting highlights here and here and here, and shadows are falling underneath the eyelid and underneath anything that creates a kind of a shelf. So what we end up with is a series of shadows and highlights that you can abbreviate this way. Usually when I'm drawing eyes, the darkest thing that I see is the shadow cast by the upper eyelid. And what we tend to not see is the whole iris. So generally it's helpful to draw just part of a circle for the iris. Sometimes you'll get a highlight in there and sometimes it'll be different values, but for the most part, if you just do this, you get a good idea of what an eye looks like. What you don't want to do is draw this almond shape with a circle in the middle like the CBS logo, right? And if you come back to your illustration of an eye, you can kind of keep going, leaving some of the highlight that is actually caught by the shelf of the lower eyelid, and then creating a shadow underneath that eye. But the way to really get good at this is just by drawing from observation a lot. You can use photographs, you can use a mirror, you can use a model if you can afford one. There's really a lot of different ways to practice drawing eyes. But again, the shorthand, I think the most efficient shorthand, is the curve or arc of the upper eyelid and the dark kind of semicircle of the iris. And you can always add more or less detail to that. But if you kind of start out with at least just this, it's going to read much more as a real eye than if you do something like this, or if you kind of fill it in like that, or whatever. These eyes work for cartoons, they work for certain kinds of illustration, but they don't read very well for observational drawings. Next, let's take a look at how to draw a nose. A nose is a kind of fleshy protuberance that comes off the front of the face and it comes toward us, and that's why people have a lot of trouble drawing noses. When we're young, we kind of draw them like this because we understand that there are two fleshy lobes around each nostril and a fleshy part in the middle that comes toward us. Sometimes we just do a single lobe for a nose, which is kind of like the SpongeBob cartoon style, like Squidward has. Or sometimes we'll do the double lobe and we will put in big circular round black nostrils. Now, there's a few problems with this. One is that, again, we're using lines instead of shadows to describe what's going on. So as soon as we get rid of our dependence on line and start looking instead towards shadow in order to help us describe things, we're going to be much better off. So what I like to do, if you're drawing a nose that's coming straight towards you, you want to start off by finding the shadows that are cast by those outside flare of the nostrils. And noses tend to cast shadows down. So the next thing you want to find out is, where is it casting a shadow? Usually it's on the upper lip somewhere. But maybe not, depending on how it's lit. What a nostril is basically a fold of skin. It's more like a cave with an opening than it is a hole. It's not a hole in your face exactly. It's more of a flap. So if you picture kind of like something like that going on, you can see how dark it is in here. But it's not just a hole like this. So what you want to do is kind of picture that. And if you start from the very darkest at the deepest part of that nostril, and then you can kind of gradually build the light out as you go. And yes, the front of the nose will have a kind of a fleshy part. It comes back. And you'll have a nose like that. Of course, noses come in all different shapes and sizes. Some people might have a very broad front of their nose, and some people might have a very skinny little part of the front of their nose. And again, we can use shadows to help describe what the nose is doing. So with noses, it's very hard to draw a nose without using shadows, but I would say if you're not going to use shadows, if for some reason your drawing just has lines in it, less is more with noses. You can get away with just the outside flare of the nostrils, maybe minimal description for the kind of cavity of the nostrils, and that's it. Maybe one or two lines higher up to describe the bridge of the nose. So we've got eyes, noses, and lastly we've got mouths. Mouths are very tricky because, again, we're dealing with kind of light bouncing off of shelves. So if you think about a mouth from the side, right, light's coming down usually, unless you're doing that campfire thing where you light yourself from the bottom with a flashlight. The light is hitting here, and it is casting shadows here and here, right? So even just from that little sketch, you can see how 3D it looks just by the use of light and shadow. Now, when you're drawing a mouth, let's start with a closed mouth because that's a lot easier. The darkest thing you're going to have is the line that separates the two lips. And it's not actually going to be a line. It's going to be little pools or pockets of shadow wherever that separation goes deeper. Okay, so wherever this right in here goes deep, that's when the shadow gets really dark. And in the corners of the mouth, there are these kind of dimples where all the skin of the face kind of goes in like that, and you get these little shadows in the corners. So once you've kind of identified the archipelago of lines or shadows that create the division between the lips, then you can start to do a little shadow under the bottom lip. Everybody has this, and that's what makes a mouth look like a mouth, right there. The top lip, meanwhile, is mostly in shadow most of the time. So if you add a bit of shadow to it, just like that, you're going to get this nice mouth-like look. You can even keep going with the shadows on the bottom lip if you want. What you don't want to do is this thing that people do, where they outline the lips. Under no circumstances do you want to do that. That is when you get like the Rolling Stones logo, this guy that looks like that. So we don't want that. What we do want is some really nicely defined features. And of course, everybody's mouth is different. Some people have similar mouths to other people, but for the most part, every time you draw a mouth, it's going to be a slightly different experience because of that wonderful biodiversity that we get among human beings. So how do we do an open mouth? Well, it's a similar principle, except you want to be very careful when you're drawing teeth because they have a different set of principles that apply to them as well. I used to study animation years ago, and something I read was that animators often look to see how people talk, and different actors, when they talk, either show their bottom teeth or their top teeth or both. And so you can kind of see the difference depending on what your person is doing. I like to not overdo it with going dark inside the mouth because otherwise it kind of looks like somebody is like sticking a black orange peel into their face like the Godfather. But otherwise, it's the same principles at work here. With teeth, one thing you want to be careful to do is not over separate them because then you get this kind of picket fence thing going on. Or if you separate the teeth too much, it looks like somebody just has a lot of gaps between their teeth. So instead, what you want to do is kind of summarize the shape of teeth. Let's try some bottom teeth this time to illustrate that. And this is all just from imagination. So think about what the light is doing. If your teeth are in shadow, they're not going to be perfectly white. Ooh, it went really dark with the upper lip that time. So something like that. All right, well, hopefully that will help you to improve your facial drawing abilities and try practicing it a bit. Use a mirror, use a picture, use whatever you want. It can really start to take off and you might surprise yourself.